Right now, in December 2025, a woman sits in a Louisiana prison cell waiting to learn if she'll live or die. Her name is Antoinette Frank. She's been on death row for 30 years, the only woman in the state waiting for lethal injection. And here's the part that should make your blood run cold. She wasn't some street criminal who got caught up in violence. She was a police officer, a sworn protector, someone the city of New Orleans trusted with a gun, a badge, and the authority to walk into your home if you called for help. But on March 4, 1995, Antoinette Frank used that trust to commit one of the most brutal betrayals in American law enforcement history. She didn't just kill a family that trusted her, she executed a fellow police officer in cold blood, in uniform, while he was on duty. This story isn't just about one bad cop. It's about what happens when we put blind faith in a uniform and ignore every warning sign screaming danger. It's about the people who saw the red flags and did nothing. And it's about the victims who paid the ultimate price for trusting a badge instead of their instincts. So before we go any further, I need you to ask yourself something. Who do you trust? And why? Is it because they've earned it, or just because of what they wear? Because what happened to the Vu family proves that sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never thought to question. To understand how Antoinette Frank became a killer, you have to go back to 1993, back to a city that was falling apart. New Orleans in the early 90s wasn't the postcard version tourists see. Sure, there were jazz clubs and Mardi Gras parades, but beneath all that, the city was drowning. Crack cocaine had torn through neighborhoods like a wildfire. Homicides were hitting record numbers. Gunshots at night were so common that people stopped flinching when they heard them. And the New Orleans Police Department? It was just as broken as the streets it was supposed to protect. Officers were leaving in droves. The ones who stayed were underpaid, overworked, and in some cases corrupt. Some were taking bribes. Others were looking the other way while drugs moved freely through the city. Trust in the police was nearly gone, especially in black communities that had been failed over and over again. The department needed help. They needed new officers. They needed people who could rebuild trust with the public. So when a young black woman named Antoinette Frank applied to join the force, they saw exactly what they wanted to see. On paper, Antoinette looked perfect. She was 23, ambitious and eager to serve. In a department desperate to improve its image and connect with the community, she seemed like a solution. But there was a problem. Actually, there were a lot of problems. Antoinette had grown up in a home where fear and control were the only constants. Her father, Adam Frank, was abusive, domineering in ways that left deep psychological scars. Later, investigators would learn he had sexually abused her throughout her childhood. That kind of trauma doesn't just disappear. It reshapes you. And for Antoinette, it taught her one lesson above all others. Power is the only thing that keeps you safe. So she learned to lie. She learned to manipulate. She learned to present whatever version of herself people needed to see in order to get what she wanted. When she applied to the NOPD, her application was riddled with lies. She exaggerated her education. She misrepresented her work history. She rewrote parts of her background to make herself look more qualified than she was. And then came the psychological evaluations. Every NOPD recruit had to sit down with a psychiatrist and pass a psychological evaluation before they could carry a gun and enforce the law. Antoinette failed. Not once, twice. Dr. Philip Scuria, the psychiatrist who evaluated her, didn't sugarcoat his findings. He described her as emotionally unstable, indecisive under pressure, and lacking the confidence needed for police work. His final recommendation was crystal clear: do not hire her. That should have been the end of it. But the NOPD was desperate. They needed officers. They needed diversity. They needed someone who looked good in a press photo. So they ignored the psychiatrist's warning. They shuffled her paperwork. They let her reapply. And on February 7, 1993, Antoinette Frank became a police officer. 3 weeks later, she graduated near the top of her academy class. The department celebrated her. The public saw her as progress. But the people who had to work beside her? They saw something else entirely. From the moment Antoinette hit the streets, her colleagues knew something was off. She was awkward in social situations, distant when others tried to connect with her. On patrol, when things got tense, she didn't react the way a cop should. She hesitated. She froze. And in a job where a split-second delay can mean life or death, that kind of hesitation is dangerous. Her supervisors noticed it too. Within 6 months, they were considering sending her back to the academy for retraining. But the department was still short-staffed, still scrambling to fill shifts. So instead of pulling her off the streets, they left her out there. Meanwhile, the public saw a completely different version of Antoinette Frank. She showed up at community meetings. She smiled for cameras. She shook hands with local leaders and accepted awards from civic groups. She was even named Officer of the Month, more than once. But it was all performance. And the cracks were already starting to show. In late 1994, Antoinette met someone who would change everything. His name was Rogers Lacaze. He was 18 years old, a known drug dealer from the Desire housing projects, one of the most violent neighborhoods in New Orleans. Their relationship was forbidden from the start. NOPD officers weren't allowed to associate with known felons, let alone date them. But Antoinette didn't care about the rules. She never had. She started bringing Rogers on ride-alongs in her patrol car. She let him wear her police jacket. She even let him carry her badge. To anyone watching, it looked insane. But to Antoinette, it felt like power. Rogers loved it too. He bragged to his friends about dating a cop. He loved the thrill of sitting in a police cruiser, flashing credentials, and watching people obey without question. Together, they started testing how far they could push it. They started pulling over random drivers. Antoinette would flash her badge, act official, and Rogers would pull out a gun and demand cash. It was a shakedown operation disguised as police work. For Antoinette, it wasn't even about the money. It was about the control. The thrill of being on both sides of the law at the same time. The power to decide who got robbed and who got to walk away. By early 1995, they wanted more. Antoinette had been working off-duty security at a small Vietnamese restaurant in New Orleans East called Kim On. The owners, the Vu family, trusted her completely. They paid her in cash. They gave her a key to the back door. They treated her like family. And Antoinette knew they kept large amounts of cash hidden inside the restaurant. Think about this for a second. The Vu family looked at that uniform and felt safe. That badge told them she was there to protect them. That trust got them killed. Just after midnight on March 4, 1995, Antoinette and Rogers went to Kim On restaurant for the third time that night. The first two visits were just recon, checking the layout, watching who was inside, making sure everything was in place. By the time they came back the third time, the Vu family was closing up for the night. The neighborhood was quiet. Most businesses were dark. Antoinette used her key to unlock the back door. Inside, the restaurant was nearly empty. Tables were wiped down. Chairs were stacked. The smell of cleaning solution hung in the air. It was supposed to be a routine end to another long day for the Vu family. But there was something Antoinette hadn't expected. Another police officer was inside. His name was Ronald A. Williams II. He was 25 years old, a respected patrolman who had taken over the same off-duty security job Antoinette used to work. He was in full uniform, doing exactly what he was supposed to do, protecting the Vu family. He never saw it coming. Rogers Lacaze shot Officer Ronald Williams 3 times. Once in the neck, once in the back, once in the head. Williams died in uniform. His service weapon never left his holster. He didn't get a chance to defend himself. He didn't even get a chance to understand what was happening. One moment he was doing his job, protecting a family. The next he was dead on the floor of a restaurant, killed by someone wearing the same badge he wore. Antoinette stood there and watched. She didn't stop it. She didn't call for help. She didn't even flinch. And when Rogers turned toward the kitchen where the Vu family was finishing their closing duties, Antoinette followed. Inside were 3 people. Ha Vu, 24 years old, the eldest sister who managed the front of the restaurant. Quang Vu, just 17, still in high school helping clean up after hours. And Chao Vu, 23, who handled the money and paperwork. They had no idea what was about to happen. Antoinette burst into the kitchen with a gun in her hand and a uniform on her back. She ordered the Vu siblings into the walk-in cooler at gunpoint. I tried to ask what was going on, but Antoinette shouted at them to move. In their minds, this was still a police officer. Someone they knew, someone they had trusted enough to give a key to their business. They were scared, but they still believed there had to be some kind of explanation. Inside that cramped cooler, confusion turned into terror. Antoinette demanded money. She wanted to know where the cash was. When 17-year-old Quang said he didn't know, she hit him across the face with her pistol. Art. The blow split his skin open. Blood hit the floor. In that moment, it became clear this wasn't a misunderstanding, and it definitely wasn't a routine police action. Antoinette tore through the kitchen, ripping open cabinets, yanking drawers, searching frantically. Eventually, she went to the microwave. Inside, wrapped and hidden, was more than $10,000 in cash. She had exactly what she came for. She could have left. She didn't. With the money in hand, Antoinette walked back to the cooler where Ha and Quang were huddled, terrified and confused. She raised her gun and fired. 3 shots into Ha. 6 shots into Kwang. The 17-year-old boy who had been mopping floors just minutes earlier was executed in cold blood. Chow Vu was still inside the cooler. She heard every shot. She watched through a crack in the door as her sister and brother were murdered by the same woman who used to sit at their tables and eat their food. The woman who wore a badge. The woman they had welcomed like family. Chow pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Her entire body shook, but she didn't move. She stayed frozen, silent, praying Antoinette wouldn't notice her. The gunfire stopped. Footsteps faded. The back door slammed shut. And just like that, Antoinette, Frank and Rogers Lacaze were gone, with $10,000 and 3 bodies left behind. I need you to sit with this for a second. A police officer, someone sworn to protect, used the trust these people gave her to rob them. And when that wasn't enough, she executed them. Even the other cop in the room wasn't safe from her. If this story makes you angry, if it makes you want to scream about how someone like her ever got that badge, then subscribe. Because stories like this don't spread themselves. The only way we hold broken systems accountable is by refusing to let them hide these failures. And if you won't subscribe, at least tell me in the comments why you think she was hired despite every red flag. I'm genuinely curious what you think went wrong here. Most criminals run as far and as fast as they can after committing murder. They hide. They lay low. They try to disappear. Antoinette Frank did the opposite. Minutes after fleeing the scene, she made one of the most audacious decisions in criminal history. She came back. She borrowed a marked NOPD squad car from another officer and drove straight back to Kim On Restaurant, still in uniform, still wearing her badge. By the time she arrived, the scene was already swarming with police. Cruisers blocked the street. Crime scene tape was going up. Officers were gathering near the entrance, trying to process what had just happened. Antoinette walked right into the middle of it. Her plan was simple and absolutely chilling. She wanted to blend in with the responding officers, act like she was there to help, and if she got the chance, eliminate the one person who could identify her. Chow Vu. But Chow had already made it out. She had crawled out of that cooler, stumbled through the back door, and ran barefoot to a neighbor's house, screaming for help. By the time Antoinette arrived, Chow was standing near the crime scene, shaking, traumatized, telling officers what she had seen. And then Chow saw her. She saw Antoinette walking through the crowd of officers, calm and composed like she belonged there. For a split second, Chow couldn't believe what she was seeing. But then the reality hit her like a freight train. She screamed, pointed directly at Antoinette. That's her. She killed them. That's the one who did it. Every officer within earshot turned. The scene froze. No one knew what to do at first. Antoinette was one of them, a fellow cop in uniform. But Chow kept screaming, hysterical, insistent. Within minutes, officers surrounded Antoinette. They disarmed her. They put her in handcuffs. And as they led her away, her colleagues stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. One of their own had murdered a fellow officer and 2 innocent people. Hours later, detectives arrested Rogers Lacaze. When they found him, he was wearing Officer Ronald Williams' wristwatch. He was using Williams' police-issued gas card. The case was airtight. She was so confident in that uniform, she thought she could come back and blend in with the good cops. That's how much she believed the badge made her untouchable. Antoinette Frank's trial began on September 5, 1995, just 6 months after the murders. The prosecution had everything they needed. Eyewitness testimony from Chow Vu, who had watched her siblings die. Ballistics evidence matching the bullets to Antoinette's service weapon. Her fingerprints on the microwave where the cash had been hidden. And the fact that she had literally returned to the crime scene in uniform. Her defense team subpoenaed 39 witnesses. But when the trial actually started, they didn't call a single one. There was no alternate theory. No claim of self-defense. No psychiatric testimony. Nothing. It was as if her lawyers had already given up. Chow Vu took the stand and told the jury everything. She described how Antoinette had forced them into the cooler. How she had pistol-whipped her 17-year-old brother. How she had searched the kitchen and found the money. And how, even after getting what she came for, she still walked back and executed Ha and Kwang in cold blood. When Chow pointed at Antoinette in the courtroom and said, "That's her. She killed my family," the room went silent. Antoinette didn't cry. She didn't react. She just stared straight ahead. On September 12, 1995, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate. Everyone expected it to take hours, maybe even days. Capital murder cases usually do. But this one was different. 22 minutes later, the jury came back. It was a record, the fastest guilty verdict in a capital murder case in New Orleans history. On all counts. First-degree murder of Officer Ronald Williams. First-degree murder of Ha Vu. First-degree murder of Quang Vu. Guilty. 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 The next day, the same jury deliberated on sentencing. This time it took them 45 minutes. Their recommendation: death. On October 20, 1995, Judge Dennis Waldron formally sentenced Antoinette Frank to death by lethal injection. She would be sent to the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, where she would become the state's only woman on death row. The courtroom erupted. The Vu family wept. Officer Williams' mother closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. Antoinette was led out in shackles, her face blank, emotionless. But the story didn't end there. Because just 2 months later, investigators would discover something that changed everything they thought they knew about her. In late December 1995, a neighbor's dog started digging under Antoinette's old house in the St. Roch neighborhood. At first, the owner didn't think much of it. Dogs dig. But then the dog pulled something out of the dirt, something round, pale, and unmistakable. A human skull. With a bullet hole in the back. Police were called immediately. Detectives arrived and began excavating the area beneath the house. What they found was a full skeleton, still partially clothed, buried in the dirt. The remains were identified as Adam Frank, Antoinette's father. He had been shot execution style in the back of the head. Antoinette had reported him missing 2 years earlier, back in 1993, claiming he had left home one day and never came back. She told investigators he was depressed, maybe suicidal. No one had questioned her story. Why would they? She was a police officer. But now the truth was clear. Before she ever wore that badge, before she killed Officer Williams and the Vu family, Antoinette had already committed murder. So let me get this straight. She had already killed once. And the system never knew. How many other warning signs did they miss? Antoinette Frank has been sitting on Louisiana's death row for 30 years. Let that sink in. 3 decades. She was 24 years old when she was sentenced. She's 54 now. She lives in a small cell at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel. She's the only woman on the state's death row. 4 years she's been waiting for appeals to be denied, waiting for execution dates to be set, waiting to learn whether she'll die by lethal injection or spend the rest of her life behind bars. In 2008, the state signed 2 execution warrants for her. Both times her lawyers filed appeals and both times the execution was stayed. The legal system moved slowly. Years passed. The case dragged on. In October 2023, Louisiana's parole board reviewed her clemency petition. They heard arguments from her attorneys. They reviewed her case file. And they rejected her request. No mercy. No second chances. But something changed in 2025. Over the years, Antoinette found religion. She started attending Bible studies in prison. She met with a spiritual advisor, Deacon Angelo Zeke Nola, who has worked with her for years. According to him, she's experienced what he calls true repentance. She acknowledges what she did. She admits responsibility for the murders. But she also claims that Rogers Lacaze coerced her, that she was acting under duress, that she was afraid of him. Some people believe her transformation is genuine. Others think it's just another performance, another version of herself she's presenting to get what she wants. But here's where things get complicated. Rogers Lacaze, the man who shot Officer Williams, the man who was convicted alongside her and also sentenced to death, he's not on death row anymore. In 2019, the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office made a deal with him. His death sentence was reduced to life in prison. So the man who pulled the trigger gets to live. And Antoinette, who was there, who participated, who came back to the scene, she's still waiting to die. In April 2025, Antoinette's legal team tried a different approach. They filed a motion arguing that her original sentence should be overturned. They pointed to her childhood abuse, her mental health issues, the fact that a psychiatrist had twice warned she was unfit to be a police officer, and claimed her original defense had been ineffective. They argued that the jury never fully understood who she was or what she had lived through before that night at Kim On. On May 15, 2025, a judge agreed, at least enough to reopen the door. He granted her the right to a new sentencing hearing. That hearing is scheduled for December 2025. This month. The state of Louisiana, led by Attorney General Liz Murrill, has made it clear they still want her executed. They're fighting to keep the death sentence in place. Her lawyers are fighting just as hard to have it reduced to life in prison. So here we are, 30 years after the murders, and the question still isn't settled. Will Antoinette Frank die by lethal injection? Or will she live out the rest of her life in a prison cell? Right now, nobody knows. This hearing is happening right now, literally this month, and I'll be following it closely. If you want to know what happens to Antoinette Frank, you need to subscribe because I'm covering the outcome the moment it drops. This isn't just history, this is unfolding justice. And if you're the type who scrolls past without subscribing, let me know in the comments. Do you think she should be executed or does she deserve life in prison? I genuinely want to hear your take on this. So here's what this story is really about: trust. The Vu family trusted a uniform. They trusted a badge. They gave Antoinette Frank a key to their business, welcomed her like family, and believed that because she wore the uniform she was there to protect them. That trust got them killed. The New Orleans Police Department trusted appearances over warnings. A psychiatrist told them twice that Antoinette was emotionally unstable and unfit to carry a gun. They ignored him. They needed bodies in uniform. They needed good optics. So they hired her anyway. That trust enabled a killer. And society, all of us, we trust that institutions will vet the people they give power to. We trust that the person wearing the badge has been properly screened, properly trained, and properly supervised. But sometimes, that trust is misplaced. And when it is, people die. So what can we actually learn from this? What's the takeaway that might actually keep you or someone you love safe? First, don't trust blindly based on titles, uniforms, or authority. A badge doesn't automatically make someone trustworthy. A uniform doesn't guarantee integrity. Authority should be respected, but it should never override your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust that feeling. Second, red flags matter, and when people show you who they are, believe them. Antoinette failed 2 psychological evaluations. Her colleagues saw warning signs from day one. But the system chose to look the other way because addressing those red flags was inconvenient. Don't make that same mistake in your own life. When someone shows you consistent patterns of dishonesty, manipulation, or instability, believe what you're seeing. Don't explain it away. Don't excuse it because of their position or their potential. Third, trust your instincts even when someone has credentials. The Vu family probably felt uncomfortable at some point. Maybe when Antoinette started bringing Rogers around. Maybe when her behavior felt off. But they ignored it because she was a cop. Don't do that. And finally, institutions fail when they prioritize image over integrity. The NOPD wanted diversity. They wanted good press. They wanted someone who looked like progress. So they ignored a psychiatrist's warnings and put a dangerous person on the streets. That kind of failure doesn't just happen in police departments. It happens in schools, in churches, in businesses, anywhere people with power choose convenience over accountability. Pay attention to how institutions respond when problems are raised. Do they address them? Or do they bury them? Antoinette Frank wore a badge for less than 2 years. But in that time she destroyed families, betrayed her department, and proved that a uniform doesn't make someone trustworthy, character does. So the next time someone asks for your trust because of what they wear or what title they hold, ask yourself, have they earned it? Or are you just hoping the system got it right? The December 2025 hearing will decide what happens to Antoinette Frank, whether the state takes her life, or whether she spends the rest of her days waking up in a concrete box, knowing what she's done and who she took from this world. When that decision comes down, it's going to reopen a lot of old wounds. For the Vu family. For Officer Ronald Williams' loved ones. For New Orleans. And honestly, for anyone who's ever believed a uniform automatically meant safety. I'll be covering that outcome in a follow-up video as soon as it's decided, what the judge rules, how the families respond, and what it says about how justice works when the person on trial used to wear a badge. If you want to be here for that, subscribe and turn on notifications because this story isn't finished yet. This is True Crime Diaries. Stay safe. Stay alert. And remember, trust is earned, not worn.
December 29th, 2006. Late night at the Rock, a former palace turned prison somewhere in Iraq. 12 young American soldiers stood in a briefing room, listening to words they'd been dreading for months. Saddam Hussein would be executed in a matter of hours. Their mission was simple: keep him calm, keep him safe, and most importantly, keep it secret. Sergeant Baglia slipped into Saddam's cell area while the former dictator slept. He quietly disabled the transistor radio, making sure Saddam wouldn't catch news broadcasts already announcing his looming death. Down the corridor, Saddam woke up. He stretched, complained about his back, and picked up a book. He had no idea this was his last night alive. For nearly 3 years, these soldiers had guarded him. They'd been ordered not to talk to him, not to engage. But orders fade when you spend 1,000 days watching someone. He'd become something they never expected, familiar, almost friendly. The man who ordered 5,000 Kurds gassed to death was about to ask his guards if they'd gotten enough sleep. Before we go further, you need to understand who this man was. Saddam Hussein was born in 1937 in Al-Auja, a tiny village near Tikrit, Iraq. His father disappeared before he was born. His older brother died of cancer shortly after. His mother, drowning in depression, allegedly tried to abort him. When that failed, she sent him away to live with relatives. He grew up with an abusive stepfather who beat him regularly. Poverty surrounded him. Violence shaped him. By the time he was a teenager, Saddam had learned one lesson: trust no one, fear nothing, take everything. He joined the Ba'ath Party at 20, participated in a failed assassination attempt, fled to Egypt, and spent years clawing his way up through coups and purges. By 1979, he held absolute power, and he used that power to destroy. In 1982, after surviving an assassination attempt in the town of Dujail, Saddam ordered retaliation. 148 Shiite men and boys were rounded up, tortured, and executed. Entire orchards were bulldozed. Families were sent to desert camps. In 1988, he launched the Anfal campaign against Iraq's Kurdish population, a genocide that killed an estimated 100,000 people. His cousin, Chemical Ali, oversaw the operation. On March 16, 1988, Iraqi aircraft dropped chemical weapons on the Kurdish town of Halabja. Mustard gas, nerve agents. 5,000 civilians died in a single day. Mothers clutching dead children in the streets. Families suffocating in basements. It was the first time in modern history a government gassed its own people. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq. Saddam went into hiding. 8 months later, American soldiers found him in a spider hole, barely big enough for a man to fit inside. He was filthy, disheveled, his beard wild. When they aimed their weapons at him, he raised his hands and said, "I am Saddam Hussein. I am the president of Iraq, and I am willing to negotiate." He was pulled from that hole like a rat. On November 5, 2006, he was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. But this isn't a story about what he did. It's about who he became in the 24 hours before he died, and what the men who watched him die saw that the rest of the world didn't. After his capture in 2003, Saddam was held at a facility the soldiers called The Rock. He was assigned a special security detail, 12 young American military police officers. They called themselves the Super 12. Their orders were clear: guard him around the clock, keep him alive for trial, and do not engage with the prisoner. That last rule lasted about a week. You can't spend 3 years watching someone without talking to them. You can't share a space with another human being for 1,000 days and treat them like furniture. So, the Super 12 broke the rules. Saddam was curious. He asked questions about America, about their families, about what they missed from home. He wanted to know if they had girlfriends, if their mothers were healthy, if they liked the food at the base. He shared cigars when he could get them. He gave advice like a father would, unsolicited, but sincere. One of the guards, Adam Rogerson, would later admit something that shocked people. He became like a family member to us. A family member. The man responsible for ordering the deaths of tens of thousands. The dictator who ruled through fear and torture. But in that cell, he wasn't the dictator. He was an old man who complained about his lower back pain. He joked that he'd gotten fat like an American because the prison food was too good. He made small talk about the weather. He asked the guards if they'd slept well, if they were taking care of themselves. It created a paradox the Super 12 couldn't escape. How do you reconcile guarding a man responsible for 100,000 deaths who's asking if your mom's arthritis is getting better? How do you separate the monster from the man when the man keeps showing up every single day? Polite, warm, human. That's the question that haunted them. And it's about to get worse. If this story is already messing with your head, you need to subscribe right now. Because what happens in the next 12 hours will challenge everything you think you know about justice, humanity, and who deserves mercy. Don't miss it. Because on the night of December 29th, 2006, the Super 12 learned that the man they'd been joking with, the man they'd shared cigars with, the man who asked about their families, would be dead before sunrise, and they had to keep smiling and pretend they didn't know. 3 a.m., December 30th, 2006. First Lieutenant Andre Jackson stood outside Saddam's cell, taking a breath he didn't want to take. Beside him was the interpreter, a man who'd spent the last 15 months translating conversations between Saddam and the guards. They'd talked about everything: family, politics, religion, food. The interpreter had heard Saddam laugh, complain, philosophize. Over time, something unexpected had happened. They'd become friends. Now, he had to tell him it was over. Jackson nodded. They opened the door and switched on the light. Saddam was awake, sitting upright on his cot. He looked at them, already knowing something had changed. "It's time," Jackson said through the interpreter. "You need to prepare for your execution." Saddam didn't flinch. He didn't cry out or beg. He simply nodded, calm and detached, as if they'd told him breakfast was ready. "I've been sentenced to death before," he said quietly. For the interpreter, those words hit harder than they should have. He would later describe that moment as the hardest thing I ever did. You don't spend over a year talking to someone, hearing their stories, their regrets, their jokes, and then tell them they have hours to live. Friend or not, monster or not, it breaks something in you. Saddam stood slowly, stretching his back the way old men do. He was aware of his habits. He knew he moved slowly, that he took his time with things. "Don't rush me," he said. Not as a demand, as a request. They promised they wouldn't. Most people think they'd face death with bravery. They imagine themselves calm, composed, at peace. But most people have never had to test that theory. Saddam Hussein had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He'd survived assassination attempts, coups, wars. He'd sentenced countless others to die. He knew what death looked like. He knew what it smelled like. And now, in a cell guarded by young Americans who'd become the closest thing he had to friends, he was being asked to face it himself. The question isn't whether Saddam was brave. The question is this: can you face death with dignity when you know you don't deserve mercy? Because in a few hours, the world would see his answer. 3:24 a.m. Saddam stood and walked to the small sink in his cell. "I'd like to wash," he said. The guards nodded and stepped back, giving him space but keeping watch. He turned on the faucet and began washing himself. Slowly, methodically. His hands moved over his face, his arms, his neck. An old man preparing himself for what came next. The soldiers glanced over occasionally but kept their distance. There was something deeply human about the moment. Something that felt too private to witness, even though they had no choice. When he finished, he dried himself with a towel and turned to his belongings. That's when the frustration started. He couldn't find the right pair of socks. He rifled through the small pile of clothes he had left, suits, a few shirts, undergarments, but the socks he wanted weren't there. "I can't find them," he muttered, half to himself. The soldiers looked at each other. Then, without a word, they started helping. They searched through his things, checking drawers, folding back blankets. The absurdity of it wasn't lost on anyone. The man who once controlled palaces and armies was now frustrated because he couldn't find matching socks, and young American soldiers were helping him look. They found them eventually, tucked under a stack of papers. Saddam thanked them. Then he paused and looked at the guards. "Did you get enough rest before the mission?" he asked. He was worried about them. After dressing, Saddam reached for a bottle of cologne. He unscrewed the cap and began applying it, generously, too generously. He poured it on his neck, his wrists, his chest. The scent filled the cell within seconds, sharp and overwhelming. One soldier would later recall, "You could smell him from a mile away." It was excessive, almost comical, but it made sense. Saddam had always been meticulous about his appearance before public events. This was his final public appearance. He wanted to look and smell like a man in control. The guards stood nearby, watching this ritual unfold. This is the same man who ordered children to be gassed. And yet, here he was, asking if his guards were tired, searching for socks, drowning himself in cologne because he cared how he'd be remembered. The human and the monster, occupying the same body in the same moment. Saddam sat on the edge of his cot, looking at what remained of his life. A few old books, their spines cracked from repeated reading. Scattered papers covered in his handwriting. Thoughts, reflections, things he'd never get to finish. A handful of suits hanging nearby. This was it. The sum total of what a dictator owned at the end. He picked up items slowly, turning them over in his hands, deciding what mattered. Then he reached for something specific, his Raymond Weil watch. The one he'd worn to court hearings. The one the world had seen on his wrist during the trial. He stood and walked to the bars. "My friend," he called out. He always called them that. One of the guards approached. Saddam held the watch through the bars, offering it. The guard stared at it, then at Saddam. "I can't take this," he said. "It's against the rules." Saddam didn't pull his hand back. "You were a good friend to me. I want you to have it, for you and me to know." The guard hesitated. Accepting gifts from prisoners violated protocol. But what was the point of protocol now? In a few hours, Saddam would be gone. Refusing the watch would only create tension in an already impossible situation. He took it. Saddam clasped the guard's wrist gently, the way a father would, and nodded. Then he turned back to his belongings and selected one of his finest suits. Dark, well-tailored, the kind he wore when he wanted to project authority. He dressed carefully, adjusting the collar, smoothing the fabric. He'd always been particular about his appearance before public events. This would be his last. By now, most of the Super 12 had gathered outside his cell. They stood in full battle gear, helmets, vests, rifles, looking like soldiers ready for combat. But their faces told a different story. Saddam noticed them. He walked to the bars, chest out, standing as tall as his aging body would allow. "You've become more family to me than any Iraqi has," he said, his voice steady. "I will die like a soldier." Then he did something none of them expected. He shook each of their hands, one by one, slowly, deliberately. And for the first time they saw tears on his face, not sobs, not breakdown, just silent tears sliding down the cheeks of a man who'd ordered thousands to their deaths and was now facing his own. One guard would later try to explain what that moment felt like. You can watch a million movies about execution, but seeing it in real life, knowing a rope will be wrapped around their neck, it's soul-crushing. And then for him to thank us, it was like, oh my God. They had guarded a monster, but the man saying goodbye felt like family. Earlier that evening, before the guards had been briefed, before anyone told him his time was up, Saddam Hussein ate his final meal. Lobster tails, delivered from the Coalition Cafe at Camp Victory, the American military dining facility. He ate eagerly, savoring every bite. Captivity had changed him in small ways. He'd put on weight over the years, his face fuller than it had been when they pulled him from that spider hole. He'd joked about it once, laughing as he patted his stomach, "I've grown fat like an American." The guards had laughed with him. Now, looking back, that meal carried a cruel irony. A man born in crushing poverty, who clawed his way to unimaginable power, who controlled palaces and oil fields and entire armies, his last meal was American lobster, cooked and served by the very forces that had torn his regime apart. There's a lesson in that. Power doesn't fill the void. It never has. It can't. At the end, Saddam wasn't thinking about his legacy. He wasn't obsessing over his place in history or the empire he'd built. He was thinking about Lobster, about finding the right pair of socks, about whether the young men guarding him had gotten enough sleep. That's what death does. It strips away everything, the titles, the fear, the control, and leaves you with the small, human things. The things that actually matter. A good meal, clean clothes, kind words from people who didn't have to be kind. In his final hours, the dictator who terrorized millions was reduced to what we all are at the end. Just a person, hoping to be remembered as something more than the worst thing they ever did. The helicopter lifted off just before dawn, cutting through the cold December air over Baghdad. The city below was silent, still asleep, unaware that history was about to repeat itself in the cruelest way possible. Saddam sat strapped in, flanked by guards, staring out at the fading lights. He didn't speak. Neither did they. After landing, he was transferred to an armored Rhino, a cramped, windowless vehicle built to withstand explosions. The ride was short but suffocating. No one said a word. When the vehicle finally stopped, the doors opened to reveal Camp Justice. It was a former military intelligence headquarters in Baghdad's Kadhimiya district, a place Saddam knew well. This was where interrogations had taken place under his regime, where suspected traitors were brought, tortured, and executed, where screams echoed through concrete hallways and bodies were dragged out in the dead of night. Now, he was the one being led inside. The irony was almost poetic. Security around the facility was suffocating. An entire American brigade surrounded the perimeter, checkpoints, guard towers, snipers on rooftops. But inside, Iraqi forces controlled everything. The Americans had strict orders. Do not enter the execution chamber. This had to be an Iraqi operation. The world needed to see that Iraqis were holding their own leader accountable, not foreign occupiers. As Saddam stepped out of the Rhino, something shifted in him. His posture straightened, his jaw set. With each step toward the building, he seemed to shed the frailty of the old man in the cell and reclaim the dictator he'd once been. He wasn't walking to his death, he was walking to martyrdom. In his mind, this wasn't justice, it was sacrifice. He was dying for his country, for his people, for a cause that history would vindicate, or so he believed. Outside, the Super 12 waited. They couldn't see the gallows directly. American soldiers weren't allowed that close, but they could see shadows moving inside the building. They could hear muffled voices, and through a gap in the structure, they caught glimpses of the rope swaying gently in the cold morning breeze. One of the guards stood there, arms crossed, staring at that rope. He thought about something Saddam had said months earlier during one of their conversations. He hated the idea of being hanged. Of all the ways to die, shot, poisoned, beheaded, hanging was the one Saddam feared most. Not because of the pain, but because of the symbolism. It was a death reserved for common criminals, for thieves and cowards, not for presidents, not for soldiers. But that's exactly what was waiting for him inside. And there was nothing left to do but watch the rope sway and wait for the sound that would confirm it was over. Inside Camp Justice, Saddam Hussein was handed over to Muwaffaq al-Rubai, Iraq's national security advisor. Al-Rubai was a Shiite activist who had spent years in exile. Under Saddam's regime, he'd been arrested, interrogated, tortured. Now, he stood face to face with the man who'd ordered it, leading him to his death. A judge stepped forward and began reading the indictments aloud. Saddam stood holding his Quran, his face calm, his posture straight. He showed no remorse, no fear, no acknowledgement that what was happening was just. When the reading finished, guards led him toward the gallows. Saddam paused on the steps looking up at the setup, the noose, the platform, the trapdoor beneath. He turned to one of the officials nearby and said, his voice steady, "Doctor, this is for men." It was a challenge, a declaration. He wasn't going to beg, he wasn't going to break. The contrast was striking. Saddam wore a dark overcoat, standing upright with his shoulders back. When they offered him a hood, he refused. He wanted his face visible. He wanted the world to see him die as a man, not a coward. Meanwhile, his executioners wore masks. As Saddam climbed the final steps, the room erupted. Shiite officials standing nearby began chanting, "Muqtada, Muqtada, Muqtada," a mocking reference to Muqtada al-Sadr, the cleric whose followers Saddam had persecuted for years. Saddam looked at them and smirked. "Do you consider this bravery?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Go to hell!" Saddam didn't hesitate. "The hell that is Iraq," he shot back. The room descended into chaos, shouting, taunting, jeering. This wasn't a solemn execution, it was a spectacle, a mob demanding blood. And in the middle of it all stood Saddam Hussein, calm and composed, ready to meet his end. The noose was placed around his neck. Saddam closed his eyes and began reciting the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." He didn't finish. The trapdoor opened mid-prayer. Outside, the Super 12 stood in silence. Then they heard it. A sudden crash, loud enough to shake the walls. It felt like an explosion. For a split second, they thought something had gone wrong. Then came the gunfire, not an attack, celebration. Chaotic, uncontrolled bursts of automatic weapons firing into the air. It was over. If you're still watching and you haven't subscribed, I need to ask you something. Do you think Saddam deserved dignity in his final moments? Or should justice be ugly? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about right and wrong, hit that subscribe button now. Because the world isn't black and white, and neither is this channel. The Super 12 sat in silence outside Camp Justice. They didn't move, they didn't speak. They just stared at the building where, moments ago, the man they'd guarded for nearly 3 years had dropped through a trapdoor with a rope around his neck. One of the guards would later admit he cried. "It was like losing a family member," he said. That statement shocked people. How could you mourn a dictator? How could you feel grief for a man who ordered the deaths of thousands? But these soldiers hadn't guarded the dictator. They'd guarded the man, the one who asked about their families, the one who shared cigars and complained about his back, the one who gave away his watch and worried if they'd gotten enough sleep. They had to reconcile their duty with their humanity, and there's no training manual for that. Here's what Saddam's final 24 hours teaches us. Power, legacy, and fear mean nothing at the end. What matters is how you treat the people in front of you. Saddam Hussein spent decades building an empire on fear. He controlled armies, palaces, entire nations. His name was synonymous with brutality. But in his final hours, the only people who mourned him were the young Americans he'd been kind to. Not his advisors, not his government officials, not the people he ruled. 12 soldiers who had no reason to care, but did anyway because he treated them like human beings. If you want to be remembered, don't chase power. Choose kindness even when no one's watching. Because at the end, the small moments are the only ones that matter. But here's the harder question. Did Saddam deserve that kindness? Can a man responsible for 100,000 deaths earn redemption by being polite to his guards? Does treating 12 people well erase the suffering of millions? I don't have the answer, but it's the question that haunts everyone who knew him in those final hours.
April 4, 2024. 10:20 a.m. Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Michael Dwayne Smith is pronounced dead at 41 years old. The needle has done its job. The families have watched through one-way glass. For them it's over. But this story doesn't start with Michael's last breath. It starts 22 years earlier in a city gripped by fear. 3 bodies. 4 months. A 19-year-old gang member who couldn't stop talking. This wasn't one crime of passion. It was a spree. 2 of those victims? They never saw it coming. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you've ever trusted the wrong person or been in the wrong place at the wrong time, this story will make your skin crawl. Because what Michael did wasn't just murder. It It was revenge. Misdirected, brutal, and unstoppable. And by the time police caught him, he'd already told everyone what he'd done. To understand what Michael became, you have to understand where he started. He was born on June 24, 1982, in Oklahoma. From the very beginning, the odds were stacked against him. His father was an alcoholic who physically abused his mother. By the time Michael turned 2, his parents had separated, and any hope of stability went with them. He grew up in a neighborhood where gang violence and drugs weren't just common, they were everywhere. There was no stable father figure. No one to guide him. Just chaos day after day. School became an afterthought. Michael struggled academically and never found his footing. His older brothers introduced him to drugs and gangs at an early age. And then came the trauma that no child should ever endure. Somewhere between the ages of 7 and 8, Michael was sexually abused by an older woman. It was a violation that went unaddressed, buried beneath everything else that was already falling apart. By the time he was 10 years old, his father died. The absence left a hole that nothing seemed to fill. Michael turned to PCP, a powerful hallucinogen that became his escape. By the year 2000, at just 18 years old, he had officially joined the Oak Grove Posse, a violent subset of the Oklahoma City Crips. Years later, in a phone interview before his execution, Michael reflected on his choices with regret. He said he had always been good at sports, that he could have easily gotten a scholarship. But surrounded by gang members and trapped in a culture of violence, he made a different choice. One he called the biggest regret of his life. By 2002, Michael wasn't just a gang member. He was already wanted on 5 separate felony charges. Shooting with intent to kill. Assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. Assault on a police officer. Attempting to elude police. Driving under the influence. He was 19 years old and he was already falling apart. Now, I'm telling you this not to excuse what he did, but because if we don't understand how someone gets here, we can't stop the next one. Michael's story is a warning about what happens when trauma goes unaddressed, when kids fall through the cracks, when violence becomes normal. Because what came next wasn't random. It was inevitable. To understand why Michael did what he did, you have to go back to November 8, 2000. That day, 3 members of the Oak Grove Posse set out to rob 2 convenience stores in South Oklahoma City. Their names were Taryn Talk Armstrong, Kenneth Peanut Kinchin, and Dwayne Pudgy Shirley. The first robbery went off without a hitch. But the second robbery, just after 8 that evening, ended in disaster. They walked into Trans Food Mart on South May Avenue. This time, Armstrong was carrying the weapon. But the store's owner, a Vietnamese man named Han Van Ho, wasn't about to be a victim. When Armstrong threatened him with the gun, Han Van Ho pulled a .38 caliber revolver from beneath the counter and shot him dead. Kinchin and Shirley fled the scene. They were eventually arrested and charged with felony murder and robbery. Han Van Ho was never charged. His actions were ruled justified self-defense. Michael wasn't involved in the robbery. But Taryn Armstrong had been one of his closest friends. And when Michael read a newspaper article about the incident, something inside him snapped. According to the article, someone connected to a neighboring store, the ANZ Food Mart, had made comments to the press. Comments that Michael believed were disrespectful to his gang. Comments that, in his mind, disrespected Taryn Armstrong's memory. In Michael's mind, someone had to pay. Not the store owner who pulled the trigger, someone else. Anyone else. It didn't matter if they were the right person. It only mattered that they were close enough. If you've ever been caught in the crossfire of someone else's anger, or if you work late nights alone in a store, what happens next should terrify you. Because Michael's revenge wasn't about justice. It was about proximity. About being in the wrong place when someone else's rage needed an outlet. And if this story keeps you safer, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a warning. Because the next case we cover might be even closer to home. 2 weeks after Armstrong's death, on November 24, 2001, Michael made his first move. He was with his 29-year-old accomplice, David Walter Burns, along with 2 other men, Melvin Moore and 26-year-old Otis Payne Jr. The 4 of them were inside an SUV parked outside the Lexus Club, a nightclub in northeast Oklahoma City. What started as a night out quickly turned violent. An altercation broke out inside the vehicle. Michael handed his gun to Burns. Then both men opened fire. The shots were meant for Melvin Moore. But the fatal bullet struck Otis Payne instead. He was killed instantly. Moore survived with a gunshot wound to his shoulder. Michael and Burns fled the scene. Police identified them quickly and issued warrants for their arrest. But Michael had no intention of turning himself in. Instead, he went into hiding, moving through Oklahoma City like a ghost, evading capture while the pressure mounted. For 3 months he stayed one step ahead of the law. But the longer he hid, the more paranoid he became. Think about Otis that night. You're just sitting in a car. Maybe you're laughing with your friends. And suddenly your friend's beef becomes your death sentence. Otis wasn't the target. He was just there. Remember that feeling, because it happens again. And on February 22, 2002, that paranoia would explode into violence. 2 more people would die. And just like Otis, neither of them would see it coming. It was just after 6:30 in the morning on February 22, 2002. Michael left his apartment at the Del Mar complex in Oklahoma City. His roommate, Marcus Berry, watched him grab a .357 caliber revolver before walking out the door. Michael had a target in mind, a man named Philip Zachary Jr. Michael believed that Zachary had been feeding information to the police, that he was the reason the cops were closing in. In Michael's mind, Zachary was a snitch, and snitches had to be dealt with. But when Michael arrived at the apartment where Zachary lived, he didn't find him. Instead, he found Zachary's mother. Her name was Janet Denise Miller Moore. She was 41 years old, a loving mother, a dedicated hospital worker in the insurance division at OU Medical Center. Her family would later describe her as a rock, someone who was always willing to lend a hand, an ear, or a kind word to anyone who needed it. That morning, Janet was alone in the apartment, getting dressed for work. She had no idea that a wanted killer was about to kick down her front door. Michael burst inside. Janet screamed. She called out for help, panicked and terrified. But there was no one to hear her. Later, in his confession, Michael described what happened next with chilling indifference. He said she panicked, that she wouldn't stop screaming, so he shot her. What? In the chest. Janet collapsed. She was dead before she hit the floor. Michael didn't run. Instead, he walked through the apartment, wiping down every surface, removing his fingerprints. When he later learned who the woman was, the mother of the man he had come to kill, he simply shrugged and said, "Oh well." No remorse. No second thought. Just, oh well. Janet wasn't supposed to die that morning. She was just getting ready for work, doing what she did every day. She wasn't part of Michael's world. She didn't know his name. She'd never wronged him. If her son had been home instead, maybe she'd still be alive. But that's the thing about revenge. It doesn't care who gets in the way. It doesn't care if you're innocent. It doesn't care if you're a mother, a worker, a person just trying to live your life. Revenge only cares about proximity. And Michael wasn't finished. Not even close. By 7:30 that evening, just 1 hour after killing Janet, Michael walked into the A&Z Food Mart in South Oklahoma City. This was the store next door to Trans Food Mart, where Taryn Armstrong had been killed over a year earlier. Michael believed that someone who worked here had made disrespectful comments about his gang to the newspaper. He had come to make them pay. Behind the counter was a 22-year-old college student named Sharath Babu Paluru. Sharath had been born and raised in Andhra Pradesh, India. He was the first person in his family to come to America, chasing a dream of education and opportunity. He was described as fun to be around, generous and inspiring. His younger brother, Harish, would later say that Sharath was the reason he became a doctor. But Sharath wasn't the person who had spoken to the newspaper. He wasn't even supposed to be working that night. He was filling in for a friend. It was a tragic case of mistaken identity, and it would cost him his life. Michael entered the store holding Sharath at gunpoint. Sharath asked him, "What did I do wrong? What did I do to deserve this?" Michael didn't answer. He raised his weapon and opened fire. 9 bullets tore through Sharath's body. Arms, legs, chest, face. Even after Sharath had fallen, Michael kept shooting. He fired until there was nothing left to fire. But he wasn't done. Michael pulled out a container of lighter fluid. He doused Sharath's body. He poured it over the cash register. He splashed it across the back room. Then he struck a match and set the store ablaze. As flames consumed the building, Michael grabbed money from the register and disappeared into the night. He went home, changed out of his bloody clothes and disposed of them. Then he started talking. Sharath was just filling in for a friend. 1 shift, 1 favor. And it cost him everything. He came to America with dreams. His family believed in him. His younger brother looked up to him. And he died asking a question that had no answer. What did I do wrong? If this story makes you think twice about who you trust or where you work late at night, and you're still not subscribed, drop a comment and tell us why. Because if one person hearing this avoids the same mistake, it's worth it. That same night, Michael returned to his apartment and told his roommate, Marcus Berry, exactly what he had done. He admitted to killing Janet Moore. A few hours later, he went to the home of a female acquaintance, 20-year-old Sheena Johnson. And once again he couldn't keep quiet. Michael told Sheena that he had gone to Janet Moore's apartment looking for her son, the one he believed was a snitch. When he found Janet instead, she started screaming. In Michael's own words, the woman wouldn't shut up, so he shot her. Then he told Sheena about the second killing. He said he had murdered a man at the store because someone there had been on television, dissing his set. He described in detail how he had set the body and the cash register on fire. What Michael didn't know was that none of those details about the fire had been made public yet. The police hadn't even connected the two murders at that point. Sheena now knew things that only the killer could know. And eventually she would tell the police everything. 2 days later, on February 24, 2002, police finally caught up with Michael. But not for the double murder. They arrested him for the killing of Otis Payne Jr., the nightclub shooting from 3 months earlier. Michael was brought in for questioning. And at first, that's all detectives wanted to talk about. But during the interrogation something changed. Detectives Janet McNutt and Teresa Sterling began asking Michael about the murders of Janet Moore and Sharith Paluru. At first, Michael denied everything. But as the hours passed, something cracked. He broke down. And on videotape, Michael Dwayne Smith confessed to both killings. He described how Janet had panicked and started screaming, and how he had shot her to make her stop. He explained how he had emptied 2 guns into Sharith's body, doused him in lighter fluid, and set him on fire. Investigators who had questioned Michael described him as very cocky and extremely verbal. Not disoriented. He understood exactly what he was saying. Here's the thing about killers who can't stop talking. They think they're untouchable. Michael confessed to 3 different people. And every word became a nail in his own coffin. In March 2002, Michael was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with burglary, robbery with firearms, and arson. Michael's trial for the murders of Janet Moore and Sharith Paluru began on June 6, 2003, in Oklahoma County. But procedural errors led the judge to declare a mistrial. A second trial began on August 28, 2003. This time there would be no mistakes. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Sheena Johnson took the stand and recounted everything Michael had told her, details that only the killer could have known. Marcus Berry testified that Michael had confessed to killing Janet Moore. And then the jury watched the videotaped confession, hearing Michael describe the murders in his own words. The defense argued that Michael had been high on PCP when he confessed, that his statements were involuntary and unreliable. They pointed to his intellectual limitations, claiming he didn't fully understand what he was doing. But the trial court disagreed. On September 11, 2003, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Guilty of robbery by firearm. Guilty of burglary. Guilty of arson. 9 days later, the same jury of 9 women and 3 men recommended the death penalty for each murder conviction, along with 85 years in prison for the lesser charges. On October 14, 2003, Oklahoma County District Judge Twyla Mason Gray made it official. She sentenced Michael Dwayne Smith to death. As she handed down the sentence, Judge Gray spoke directly about the victims. She called them hardworking individuals who did not deserve to be murdered. She said the death penalty was appropriate given the brutality of the crimes. In March 2004, Michael returned to court to face charges for the murder of Otis Payne Jr., the nightclub shooting from November 2001. After a 5-day trial, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the sentence ordered to run consecutively with his 2 death sentences. For more than 2 decades, Michael fought to stay alive. His attorneys filed appeal after appeal, raising claims of intellectual disability and involuntary confession. In 2007, his first appeal was denied. His IQ scores ranged from 71 to 79, just above the legal threshold for intellectual disability. At 21 years old, Michael Dwayne Smith had been convicted of 3 murders. He would spend the next 2 decades on death row. But even on death row, Michael couldn't stay out of trouble. According to prosecutors, he remained in contact with gang members both inside and outside the prison. As recently as 2019, he was caught with weapons in his cell. The state argued that he remained a continuing threat to society. In August 2022, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals issued death warrants for 25 inmates. Michael was on the list. His execution was scheduled for April 4, 2024. On March 6, 2024, 1 month before his scheduled execution, Michael appeared before the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board via video call. For 15 minutes, he pleaded for his life. He expressed his deepest apologies and sorrows to the families of his victims. But then he did something that would doom his chances. He maintained his innocence. "I didn't commit these crimes," Michael said, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't kill these people. I was high on drugs. I don't even remember getting arrested." His attorney, Mark Henriksen, argued that Michael was intellectually disabled. He said years of drug abuse had worsened Michael's condition, and that his confession had been made in a PCP-induced haze. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They reminded the board of Michael's detailed videotaped confession. They played clips of him describing the murders in graphic detail. They pointed out that he had confessed not just to police, but to Sheena Johnson and Marcus Berry as well, people who had no reason to lie. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond called Michael a ruthless killer who has confessed to his crimes on multiple occasions. The families of Janet Moore and Sharith Puluru were present at the hearing. They asked the board to deny clemency. Sharith's brother, Harish Puluru, had submitted a written statement. He described how Sharith had been the first in their family to come to America, how he had inspired Harish to become a doctor. He described the pain his parents lived with every day. The board voted 4-1. Clemency was denied. After 22 years, Michael had one last chance to take responsibility. Instead, he claimed innocence. And the families who had waited over 2 decades? They weren't buying it. In the days leading up to his execution, Michael made one last attempt to save his life. His attorneys filed emergency appeals with the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. They were denied 4 times. On the morning of April 4, 2024, just hours before he was scheduled to die, Michael's lawyers made a final plea to the United States Supreme Court. They argued that his confession had not been sufficiently corroborated. The Supreme Court denied the stay. The execution would proceed. The night before, Michael was offered a last meal. He declined. He didn't want anything. As the hour approached, Reverend Jeff Hood, Michael's spiritual advisor, joined him in the execution chamber. Hood would later say that Michael was tearful in those final minutes, struggling with the weight of what was about to happen. At 10:08 a.m. on April 4, 2024, the execution process began at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. Michael lay strapped to the gurney. When the execution team leader asked if he had any final words, Michael's response was brief. "Nah, I'm good." He then turned to Reverend Hood and spoke quietly. His microphone was off, so the media witnesses couldn't hear what he said. But prison officials later revealed that Michael was expressing his love for his family. At 10:09 a.m., the first drug was administered, a sedative called midazolam. Michael's body reacted almost immediately. Witnesses saw him shake briefly and attempt to lift his head from the gurney before relaxing. Then came a series of short audible breaths, sounds that resembled snores or gasps. At 10:14 a.m., a masked doctor entered the chamber. He shook Michael several times and declared him unconscious. About a minute later, Michael appeared to stop breathing. At 10:19 a.m., the doctor returned to check for a pulse. At 10:20 a.m., Michael Dwayne Smith was pronounced dead. He was 41 years old. Reverend Hood, who had stood beside Michael throughout, later described the moment. He said a single tear fell from Michael's right eye after he appeared to be gone. In the witness room, Janet Moore's son, Philip Zachary Jr., and her niece, Morgan Miller Perkins, watched through one-way glass. For 22 years, they had waited for this moment. After the execution, Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond read statements on behalf of the victims' families. Janet Moore's family offered a prayer of gratitude. They thanked the state for pursuing justice over the past 2 decades. Sharith Puluru's family spoke of the devastation his death had caused. Janet Moore's family called her a rock. Sharith Puluru's family said he was the life of their close-knit family. Both were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Neither had done anything wrong. Neither had been Michael's intended target. Janet was just getting ready for work. Sharith was just filling in for a friend. For their families, April 4, 2024, was the day justice was finally served. But not everyone agreed. Reverend Don Heath, chair of the Oklahoma Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, offered a different perspective. He described Michael as a troubled and vulnerable young man with intellectual disabilities, someone who had been failed by the system at every turn. Michael Smith has a painful story, Heath said. A 10-year-old boy with borderline intellectual disability loses his father, gets strung out habitually on PCP, and joins a gang with tragic results when he is 19. "We all stand in need of mercy," he continued, "and Smith has gotten precious little. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Michael killed 3 people. Otis Payne, Janet Moore, Sharath Paluru. Their families will carry that grief forever. But does executing Michael make us safer? Or does it just mean we failed a broken kid before he ever had a chance? So here's what I want to know. Was justice served? Or did the system fail everyone involved? Michael, the victims, and the families left behind? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think, hit that subscribe button, because the next case we cover might hit even closer to home.